A common assumption drives much of education policy: the belief that mastery of a complex subject is the sole requirement to teach it effectively. When a top-tier expert attempts to pass their knowledge directly to a novice, the data stream fragments and fails upon impact. The expert's knowledge structure is too dense, and the novice's cognitive bottleneck cannot parse the raw information. Even when the expert is an articulate communicator, the structural disconnect remains. The problem is not one of personality, but of cognitive architecture. It exposes a central tension in education. Knowing the truth of a domain is a separate cognitive state from knowing how to transfer that truth into a new mind. Deep subject matter knowledge lacks the internal instructions for its own transmission, creating an epistemological gap. Historically, teaching was viewed as an intuitive craft, much like a potter shaping wet clay. It was a physical process passed down through undocumented apprenticeship, rather than a structural science. Modern education has shifted toward treating teaching as an engineered profession. Professional teacher education rests on a specific academic architecture that bridges cognitive science and domain knowledge. To understand effective education, we must map the architectural intersection where raw academic content transforms into a teachable curriculum. We can map this academic architecture in 3 dimensions, starting with the baseline requirement: subject matter knowledge. Professional teaching demands fluency in a subject area. An educator cannot translate a concept they do not comprehend. This foundation relies first on a subcomponent known as substantive structures. Substantive structures are the accepted facts, central paradigms, and explanatory frameworks specific to a given academic discipline. In physics, this includes the laws of thermodynamics. In history, it is the accurate timeline of global events. While substantive structures provide the raw material of education, possessing this material is only the first step of the professional architecture. A professional educator must also understand the internal logic that governs their discipline. This requires the second subcomponent of the foundation: syntactic structures. These are the rules of evidence, validation, and inquiry that a specific field uses to generate new knowledge. It is the difference between knowing a historical date and knowing how a historian validates a primary source document to confirm that date. Teachers must possess this syntactic knowledge to explain how we know a fact is true. Without syntactic knowledge, educators transmit dogma, failing to teach students how to think within the parameters of the discipline. Having mapped the subject matter, we must now account for the independent variable in the educational matrix, the cognitive reality of the learner. This requires a second vital foundational block: general pedagogical knowledge. This block encompasses cognitive psychology, developmental stages, working memory limits, and classroom management systems. These principles operate universally. A 10-year-old's working memory limit remains the same, whether they are learning algebra or geography. Understanding the biological and psychological mechanisms of how a brain acquires information is a distinct science from the information itself. One policy misconception is the belief that learning subject matter and psychology in parallel is sufficient to create a teacher. The academic foundation of teacher education is the engineered fusion of these blocks. When these foundations intersect, they generate a new category of expertise: pedagogical content knowledge, or PCK. Pedagogical content knowledge is the defining academic discipline of teacher education. Developing it requires a professional educator to dismantle their own advanced understanding of a subject. They then rebuild that subject entirely, using the cognitive architecture of a novice as the blueprint. PCK functions as the machinery that translates specialized knowledge into a teachable form. We can see how this architecture functions by tracking a single piece of data through the PCK mechanism. Raw domain data, an abstract mathematical formula representing fractions, enters the system. PCK filters the data through a 10-year-old's cognitive model, anticipating misconceptions about numerators, and outputting the data as a visual area model. This translation dictates the selection of analogies, the sequencing of steps, and the pacing of delivery. This underlying calculation is the science hidden inside a successful classroom lesson. This completed epistemological matrix defines the professional boundary. It forms the structure required to support a functioning educational system. The academic foundation of teacher education is a measurable framework combining substantive truth, syntactic logic, and cognitive reality. Removing any of these components leads to structural collapse when applied at scale. This model illustrates why teaching functions as a specialized, engineered discipline. Treating teaching as a generic soft skill ignores this entire academic architecture. When policies assume domain experts can be dropped into classrooms without formal training, they force a complex system to rest on a monolithic block of raw data. This compromise affects both the integrity of the institution and the cognitive development of the students. Human knowledge does not transfer itself automatically. Professional teacher education is the architectural mechanism that allows knowledge to survive the jump from one generation's mind to the next.